Good afternoon, and welcome back to the afternoon of the first day of the National HR Virtual Summit Directors Forum. And we're very lucky to have in the straight after lunch shift, which I'm sure he specially requested, Jody Hoare from People and Culture Strategies, actually the legal partners for us for this event. And Jody's already spoken, I think, in the main event, and is now going to come and give us the benefit of his wisdom in the Directors Forum. As I'm sure you know, Joydeep is the founder and still the managing principal of People and Culture Strategies. I always regretted not stealing that name first. Such a great and descriptive name for what you do, that I should have nicked it, but you got there first. Joydeep has written books, spoken at conferences around the world. He's an eminent authority. This is your chance to get some free consulting as well as listen to him talk. So questions, if you have any questions at any stage, just stick them in that public chat, and we will try to get to them at the end to make sure you get what you need from this session. So with that, Joydeep, I'm going to hand over to you, and looking forward to hearing you talking about employment law considerations for the executives during our recovery phase. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, John. Thanks for the welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see some familiar names. I'd love to say familiar faces, but familiar names at least on the attendee list on my screen here. So thanks for giving up your time. I should flag that what I'm going to be discussing in this particular session is very similar. I won't say identical because I've never done two identical presentations ever in my life, but it's very similar to what I covered in the main conference earlier. So if the span of my fan club reaches to people wanting to hear me speak about the same subject twice, I'm extremely flattered, but I felt in fairness that I should let you know that that's what was going to be discussed. I appreciate that as senior leaders within the HR community, the last few months have no doubt been extremely challenging for you, and certainly if we're here together, I'd be in person, I'd be asking the question of how are you guys doing? Because the question that we know that all of you as leaders of the HR function, or one of the leaders of the HR function in your respective organisation, the check-ins that you have to have with all of your people, the check-ins that you have to have with other members of your senior leadership team around how they are coping with everything, is a question and a provocation, if nothing else, that has to be validly asked of each of you. So I would remind you all to ensure that you are taking care of yourselves and your well-being. And it is very difficult, I know as well as anyone, that it is difficult to keep a brave face and a strategic mind and the optics of someone who is unflappable, as we all have to as senior leaders, but particularly those of us in senior HR roles, in the middle of everything that's going on. When we're talking about this subject of a post-COVID recovery, I think I have to pause and really just challenge myself, and we all probably should challenge ourselves on, is it a little bit premature for us to be talking about a post-COVID recovery? If you go by what the Reserve Bank of Australia and the OECD have said about the Australian economy and the forecast for the Australian economy, we are not looking at a recovery anytime soon. In fact, the RBA only a couple of days ago had to revise its forecasts for the Australian economy downwards quite considerably and significantly, not just because of what has happened in Victoria, but because of the reality that the economy is currently, and certainly employment, is largely propped up by a number of government stimulus initiatives, of course, such as JobKeeper. Interesting when we're talking about timeframes, of course, that something like JobKeeper was, when introduced, is meant to have a drop-dead date, as I'm sure all of you are aware, of 30 September. And I remember presenting a couple of webinars and sessions soon after JobKeeper was introduced, doing the dissecting for my clients and others of all of those very complex provisions. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, 30 September is a long time away. The government's almost factored in an extreme buffer there, because things should hopefully be well and truly back to, in inverted commas, normal by that particular stage. And here we are, some 6, 7 weeks away from that particular date. And we already know that it has been extended for several months beyond that date. And the question really for all of us is, is that going to be enough? And all of the data suggests that once JobKeeper comes to an end, we are expecting unemployment figures to rise by, I think the RBA statistics were something like 5 or 6%. And who knows what else is going to happen. Just reading literally in the break between the main conference session that I presented and this session, that a number of Victorian businesses who were just able to survive through their stage 3 lockdowns are now pretty much shutting up shop in stage 4. So this is something that is an extremely difficult time. It's trite to observe that. But I think what characterises this more so than anything else is the uncertainty, and the fact that perhaps more so than any other economic crisis, or let's call it a business or organisational crisis, the impact of our own decision making as leaders is far less significant than could ordinarily be the case. And let me explain that. It's not to suggest that the impact that our decisions will have is less significant, but our ability to control the overall outcome through that decision making is going to be less, largely because there are so many external uncontrollable factors that do not lend themselves to being ameliorated or modified through our business decision making, as other crises or challenges might. When we talk about organisations needing to pivot, organisations needing to be agile, reinvent, innovate, all of those kinds of things, we know that all of those triggers in our organisations happen often in the face of adversity. We lose a major client, we're subject to a new regulatory regime, more competition, different competition, other global factors. But what we've seen with COVID-19 since March 2020 is that it is a moving proposition by the day. And while it's not for me, certainly in this forum, to be talking about any analysis of the health aspects of the pandemic, what we know is that even at its most basic level, you think you've got it under control, but you don't. And it doesn't take very much for it to spiral out of control. And then the consequences of that are felt organisation-wide. So I think we do have to be careful in terms of jumping too quickly to this notion of we should be in this post-COVID recovery mindset, because it's going to be a long time before we're even in that space. And that will certainly be a quality problem to have. Right now and for the foreseeable future, this is all during COVID. Regardless of what the numbers, what the stats are, we are managing through COVID as we speak. There's no post-COVID. And there are many things that I know in your organisations you've had to implement already. And I know many of those things are continuing to be challenges for you, as they are for so many clients. So please don't feel as though these are things that you should all be on top of. One of the phrases of the many sort of overused phrases over the last 6 months, but one that's probably come to fruition more in recent times, is this notion of the new normal. Now, I'd like to just reflect on that particular phrase, because as we think about the challenges, legal and otherwise, that confront organisations and executives and leadership groups at this particular time, there is a danger in moving too quickly to the acceptance of a new normality. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at just a simple issue, such as working from home or the location from which work was performed. And I want to start this discussion by going well back before the onset of the COVID pandemic and talking about working from home, parameters, its existence or incidence, if you like, in most organisations. And I'm sure within your own organisations, you have had numerous people who have been working from home, some as part of their contractual arrangements, some as part of ad hoc arrangements to accommodate particular circumstances. Some, let's face it, as busy people, particularly in senior roles, do just for the purposes of catching up, weekends, late nights, whatever it might be. But working from home in and of itself is not a practice that has only been promulgated or initiated or introduced through the COVID-19 pandemic. Working from home has been in place for a long time. But how was working from home managed previously? Well, it was managed often through discussion, debate, often the need for a level of sign-off from a person's line manager or boss, often through a requirement that there be appropriate health and safety auditing, working from home checklists, toolkits, and we've developed lots of these for our clients over the years. So you had a fairly long run up to the pitch, as it were, before agreeing to or allowing someone to work from home. Bring on COVID-19, bring on public health orders, edicts, guidelines, call them what you will, but a response to that, forced, some might say, on many employers, and in fairness, without, I think, in many instances, a proper pushback from a lot of employers who did themselves a big disservice. For those of you who are interested in my views on this, you can go to the peopleculture.com.au website, and in our blogs and news section, which is inundated or littered with hundreds of articles and TV interviews and all sorts of things, you'll see a piece that I've written there about working from home and the impact that it has on business and organisations, notwithstanding the extensive chest beating by a number of employers seeking to make themselves prominent by indicating that they have embraced working from home as the new holy grail of working. But anyway, it was introduced well before, but what COVID did was it became forced. And once it became forced, once it became mandated, the reality was that organisations had to embrace it. You had to have people working from home. So what then got lost? Well, what got lost was a lot of the auditing, a lot of the safety measures, a lot of the checking and pressure testing and validation of whether this was an appropriate working arrangement for an individual, group of individuals, team, or indeed a whole organisation. All of that naturally, understandably, fell by the wayside. And then all of a sudden, people have to adjust to it, and people had to adjust to it in the most extraordinary of circumstances, often dealing with a partner also working from home, depending on the schooling arrangements in place at a particular state or a particular school, often having children at home as well, having to homeschool, all of these kinds of things. Now, the feedback around the traps, around the corporate traps, was mixed, as I'm sure it has been in your organisations. I'm sure many people have said, I feel that there's no start or stop time to my work, so I feel like I'm working more. For a lot of people, if they were being truthful and perhaps not so truthful to their bosses, but they would be saying, well, I'm working less because really there's not as much accountability. There's not as much visible accountability. And in addition to that lack of accountability, managers themselves were probably having to juggle a whole range of additional responsibilities and duties and really just lacked the bandwidth or time to provide the necessary supervision and guidance to ensure that people were working productively and efficiently. But where I'm going with this particular example, and I've just picked one, is that I would just encourage you to reflect on what would be the descriptor used by your people if they are continuing to work from home, either exclusively or in part, around what working from home now means for them in the context of normality. In other words, is it the case that they would say, I now consider that me working from home is my new normal, and that is how I see myself continuing to work on an indefinite basis? Or is the perspective of your workforce going to be that this started off for me as something that was going to be short term, but now it is becoming a longer than short term, and while I wouldn't necessarily say that it's on an indefinite basis, I have kind of settled that this is just going to continue, but it's probably going to come to an end at some point. Or will they fall into the third logical remaining category, which is people who think that this is something that is going to end fairly quickly? The point is, depending on how they answer that particular question and what thoughts and viewpoints they share on this particular subject, hinges the question on what is normal and how quickly or readily we might fall into the trap of accepting a level of normality. Do you know in your organisations what your position would be if, for example, there was no restriction, no encouragement, no guidelines for any of your people to be working from home, and that you've got the office space, you've got their or the physical premises space for them to come back to work and work as per, in inverted commas, normal, or how they did pre-COVID? Would you be bringing them back or would you not? And the question you have to ask yourself is, well, that depends. Well, here's where we start to need to show our leadership and our strategic acumen. Because my challenge to organisations would be, you've gone through, as my little narrative here has probably made fairly clear, you've gone from this space where someone working from home might have required them to go through particular hurdles or at least certain processes to be satisfied. And then all of a sudden, because of something outside of your control, if you're going to move to, actually, you know what, this has worked really well for us. We've now learned that people's jobs can be done from anywhere. And therefore, we don't really care whether people come to their usual place of work or not. What does that say about how on top of you as a leadership group, as a bunch of executives are, of what good looks like in terms of at least where people do their work? And these are the questions that organisations need to be asking themselves a lot more. What I would encourage all of you to focus on in this particular session, my main kind of suggested takeaway, is really focusing your energies at this particular point in time on planning. And the reason we need to focus on planning is because things are going to change, perhaps fairly significantly, if not very significantly. And while there might be some months before that change happens, the impact of that change is something that you need to be prepared for now. It's something that your people are looking to you to be prepared for. And while it might not be the case that you necessarily need to communicate what are the decisions that are going to be made, as I say to any group of leaders when I'm doing a workshop with them on change management, or when I'm working with them on introducing significant change within their organisation, not necessarily downsizing change, but any change. But what I say to them is that where there is uncertainty, you need to share with your people what are the data points and the triggers for things going a particular way. I even used the example in that particular situation where in the context of a change management exercise, a leader, CEO, a general manager, someone in a senior business role, presenting to a group of people who are affected, and let's assume that some of those people are going to be affected by way of loss of their jobs through redundancy, retrenchment, etc. And they're presenting the Q&A deck, and we're all familiar with these Q&A decks and these decks that are often developed over several months, leading to people getting deck fatigue, as I have often said to project teams to lighten the mood. But, you know, you're presenting to a group and then someone will ask you the question, is this the end of the change? You know, you've talked to us about why you've needed to do it. You've told us what you're going to be doing. You're telling us that my mate or mates over here are probably going to be losing their jobs. Is this the end of the change? And what often happens, and more often than not does happen, is that the answer to that question from most leaders is they say, I don't know. And it's a terribly inadequate answer. And it's not necessary for it to be inadequate, as honest and authentic as it might be. The better answer to that particular question is for an organisation and its leadership to say, we can't guarantee or predict what the impact of this change is going to be. All we can say, firstly, is that we wouldn't be making these changes if we didn't think it was in the best interests of our organisation, said department, or whatever else. But what we can tell you as our employees is that the things that we are going to be looking at closely as the data points or the key metrics whereby we will make our decision as to what further changes are necessary are these. And what that does is it shows your people that you are not afraid of publishing what it is that are the key metrics whereby future decisions are going to be made. Strategically, it also has the significant advantage of telegraphing to your workforce further changes that might be happening, but also gives them some opportunity, if it is feasible, for them to potentially influence the outcome. And this is the kind of thinking that leadership teams and executives need to really infuse at this particular point in time. So focus right now has got to be on planning. And our focus in terms of how we disseminate and communicate our plans needs to be infused with this mindset of what would best practice look like if we were dealing with this, for example, as part of a change management exercise. I also encourage all leaders and all organisations for that matter to understand the importance and significance of a holistic approach when it comes to the handling of people issues, and no more so than through this particular pandemic. Some of you, I know, are familiar with my quadrant methodology, a paradigm philosophy, call it what you will, that I developed a number of years ago, and that came about as a result of many years of firefighting with my clients, not with my clients, but dealing with firefighting, I guess, within my client organisations, in response to particular challenges. And the classic situation of, we want to get rid of this particular person. How do we get rid of them? We don't want to make them redundant, but we kind of are happy to make them redundant. It's not a real redundancy. It's a performance issue. It's all messy. It's all ugly and whatever else. Of course, doing my job to the best of my ability, that would more often than not result in good outcomes, relatively painless outcomes, and that's the advantage of having a strategic rather than a purely legal approach to these kinds of matters. However, what struck me in those, I'd say, formative years for myself as a professional was that notwithstanding that organisations were understanding the need to get legal input in relation to a decision, a commercial decision, they weren't solving their overall problems and certainly weren't doing anything to build the right culture or even look to embed any kind of performance culture in their organisation, because they were not embracing issues holistically, which is what led me to develop my people management quadrants, which are essentially the 4 key areas through which any people management challenge or problem needs to be filtered or processed. And the first of those quadrants, of course, is the business or commercial imperative that needs to be achieved. If someone's underperforming, that's an issue, not just because you don't like the person, but it's because that underperformance is likely to be having a business impact. That business impact is something that has to be addressed, has to be stopped, if possible. And of course, we know that business outcome can't just be achieved by saying to that person, we think you're an underperformer, out you go. There are laws, there are requirements, there are expectations from a legal point of view as to how you go about managing or handling this so-called underperformer. Well, what are those expectations? Well, it might be that you have to put someone on a performance improvement plan, you need to give them warnings, etc. The point is that the first 2 quadrants are your business and commercial quadrant and your legal quadrant. What must you do? What do you have to do? Filtered through the lens of what can you do or what can't you do. But even though that was happening a lot in my observation in the early years of my practice, it was what I refer to as the below the line quadrants. And if anyone's interested in more detail around quadrant methodology, I'm happy to send you through a presentation on this. If you're on LinkedIn with me, just drop me a note and say, PMQs in the message, and I'll send that to you. Or if not, please join me on LinkedIn and we can deal with it that way. But it was the quadrants that are below the line, being what I refer to as the psychology quadrant or the sociology quadrant, which are the areas where organisations still to this day are not paying the requisite attention. And as you are advising your executive teams, or as you are co-decision making with your executive teams through this most extraordinary of times, it is your responsibility as senior HR professionals to be reminding your executive teams of the critical importance of them looking at the psychology. In other words, what relevant people, by relevant I mean people who are likely to be affected by a decision or proposed decision, what those relevant people are thinking or feeling, and what has led to them thinking or feeling that particular way. That is the third quadrant. And the fourth quadrant is what I describe as the sociology quadrant. In other words, what does this look like? How does this look? What are the optics of this? So what we've done through our quadrant methodology, and I just cannot impress enough how critical this is in managing your current situations for most of your organisations. You need to achieve your business outcomes, and that outcome might be nothing more than survival. For some of you, you're in a fortunate position. It might be about excellence and continued growth in market share or whatever else. But for many of you, it's about survival, or it's about withstanding a challenge that you don't know the full scale of just yet. Broadening it from focusing on that and albeit, yes, ticking off the relevant legal boxes, but infusing it with this strong sense of how do we manage what people are thinking or feeling. And also having regard to how it looks, because how it looks is going to dictate the legacy impact of your decision-making, communications, indeed your thinking at this particular point in time. As I keep saying to my clients, this is a big challenge at the moment, no question. Probably the biggest challenge for the Australian economy and for many organisations since the GFC. But it is not the last challenge that those organisations or that your organisations are going to face. And there will be people who will be with you as your employees during the next and subsequent challenges, who will be looking to how you dealt with this particular challenge as perhaps instructive or the benchmark for how you deal with future challenges. That's the sociology quadrant. So navigating through all of the respective challenges through this holistic perspective is going to stand you in very good stead. Let's face it, it's hard. And you know, I've had many a frank conversation with clients over the last few months where they said, you know, Joydeep, I completely understand what you're saying around the thinking and feeling, but it's pretty difficult when we feel that if we're being frank, we're not really on top of our own business at the moment. You know, we're struggling to get on top of JobKeeper. We're struggling to get people to buy into a number of the initiatives. We're just trying to get by, and you know, we appreciate that it's tough for our people, but we don't really have the bandwidth to be checking in on people to see how they're thinking or feeling. And that's a completely understandable perspective. But we need to be aware that failure to check in, the assumptions that we might be making, and a common assumption, let's face it, that we all make in these kinds of times is to think that, well, because everyone knows what's going on, because all news is dominated by news of the pandemic, be it here or globally, everyone should get that we're busy. Everyone should get that we've got other things to do than be checking in on their welfare. But this is where you need to give strong emphasis and prominence to your employee assistance programs. This is where you need to be affiliating with organisations who specialise in providing the necessary employee welfare, looking at your mental health plans, but more so than anything else, focusing strongly on the calibre of your line management and your leadership so that they are equipped to have the necessary conversations with people about their well-being. These are all skills, and these are all skills that in an environment where so much is difficult to manage, even getting through day to day is a challenge for most. Infusing and embedding these skills into your leadership group is certainly not something that can happen in a hurry. So having talked about that need for that holistic approach, And you know, you can filter that particular model or lens, and I welcome any comments either in this forum through the chat function or discussions with me subsequently. And I challenge anyone to provide me with any situation that involves people in their organisation that is not going to be dealt with better through a holistic lens than one that is not a holistic lens. And in, you know, certainly the decade or so since I've been working with and advising organisations on quadrant methodology, I'm yet to be provided with a situation where someone has been able to prove to me that a purely legalistic response or a purely commercial-based response is going to be a better way to deal with the people management challenge. So having indicated the importance of that, and you can say, all right, well, let's just take working from home, or let's take reduction to people's pay, or let's take some redundancies that are likely to ensue. What would, knowing that we're going to be applying this holistic lens to our approach, in our approach to dealing with those particular problems, what are some of the headline legal issues? And so let me share what I think are the 5 critical legal areas that you need to be working through as actions within your organisations. And I would suggest, certainly if I'm a CEO, well, I am a CEO, but if I'm a CEO in a client organisation, I would be wanting to know what is our plan, not just from a risk management point of view, but also from a proactive best practice point of view, given that we know that that artificial life support that is JobKeeper, that's keeping some 3.5 million Australian jobs afloat at the moment, is going to end at some stage. And it could have a significant impact on your organisation, be it directly or indirectly. So here are the 5 areas. The first area is the need for your organisation to be properly on top of and managing its contract administration in relation to its employees. And why is that important? Well, look, I know that employment lawyers at everything you go to will talk about the importance of contracts and the need for updated contracts, but I get it. I get it's one of those things that most HR professionals would say and acknowledge is important, but it's something that is hard to do. But when it's hard to do, it's only some specific context in which it's hard to do. Worked with numerous organisations around reissuing, reviewing, amending their standard contract templates. But the prickly part of it is not getting the template right. The prickly part of it is getting those people who've been in your organisation for a long time and who may not have a current and accurate employment contract to sign up to this fancy new updated whiz-bang employment contract that you present to them. Now, for those organisations who put that in the too hard basket, unfortunately, they are less likely, I would suggest at this particular point in time, to have success with signing people up to new contracts, because the transparency of that is probably not going to work in your favour organisationally. But what's the downside of that? Well, the downside is that in this environment where you may be needing to let people go, make people's positions redundant, in addition to whatever might be your position on severance pay or redundancy pay, be that from the National Employment Standards or a redundancy policy or whatever it might be, we assume that the notice periods are the periods of notice that are set out in someone's employment contract, as we should. But what happens when that employment contract is either unwritten or it's only written in the form of a document that was issued some 25, 30 or more years ago that really has no relevance to the terms and conditions of someone's actual employment at this particular point in time? The rubber hits the road when that person turns around and says, well, you know, you might say I've got an employment contract, but that's old, that's not valid. The legal position is that I therefore do not have any written contract. The legal consequence is that I am therefore entitled to reasonable notice of termination. And reasonable notice, depending on a person's seniority and their job prospects and, you know, the extent of specialisation of skills, which is a genuine legal concept, can be as high as 18 months in some instances. Now, that would be the exceptions, but certainly finding reasonable notice for someone who's got more than 20 years service, who's earning above 150,000 in your organisation in the 9 to 12 months range is not far-fetched at all, and indeed is what you should be factoring in. So that's something that needs to be costed, and you can only cost it when you've done some proper auditing around what is the situation with people's contracts. You know, your executive team are going to be looking at the cost of redundancies in terms not of notice. They'll be looking at it in terms of the severance pay. They'll be looking at it in terms of the annual leave payout. They'll be looking at it in terms of the long service leave payout. And maybe they'll be looking at STI impact or LTI impact. They very rarely will be expecting that there is going to be a liability that attaches or flows from the person not having a current valid employment contract. So that's area one, contract, auditing, administration. Happy to develop strategies with you if this is something that you feel is an issue in your organisation. Secondly, and sticking with the termination and redundancy theme, always important to look at what are your options when it comes to alternatives to redundancy. Now, some of you I know have implemented directed annual leave. Some of you have reduced days and or pay levels for people. Never a pleasant thing to do. I just urge you to not fall into the trap of thinking that just because you put something in place once, that therefore that becomes a closed issue with your people. Regular discussion around those kinds of things, I think, is nothing more than a fundamental employment relationship courtesy. Leave aside whether it might be a legal obligation or not. What's your policy going to be in relation to redundancy payments? How else are you going to be managing leave liabilities and things like that? If you have time, as I'm suggesting you do, to get your house in order prior to having to make those significant decisions, you are putting yourself in the best economic position to allow that significant decision making to have a minimal impact or not as significant an impact on your organisation as might otherwise be the case. The third legal area, in addition, so number one is contracts, and number two is thinking about termination and redundancy parameters. The third is the broad issue of working from home and safety. Now, as I said, for many people pre-COVID, working from home was something that was subject to a lot more auditing and due diligence before it was being put in place. Well, just because it might have been something that came about through public health orders or best practice recommendations or our premiers and prime ministers putting words around, you know, whether you can work at home or can't work at home and whatever it might be, there is nothing to stop you. And indeed, I would strongly encourage you to look very closely at whether the arrangements that are in place for your people as to where they work are in the best interests of your organisation. And only one component of that is the safety component, but it is a very important component. It goes without saying, if you're bringing people back, you need to be aware of making your workplace COVID safe and some wonderful resources that are all available on numerous websites that can assist you through that particular process. But this whole area of location is where quadrant methodology becomes very important. How does a person think or feel when they have been working from home for as long as they have, and then all of a sudden they've been told that they can't or that they won't? For some, that will be the best news they've had this side of mid-March. For others, it will be the end of the glory days. Now, some of that might be work-related, some of that might be lifestyle-related. Different people are different. But some consideration as to how they're thinking or feeling, the psychology quadrant, will never go astray. The fourth point that I would put on this particular list relates to the issue of performance, performance management, and indeed how you go about developing a high-performance culture. It seems to me that in many organisations, the whole cultural journey, particularly when it comes to something like performance, has just been parked because everyone is just focused on getting through. And I understand that. But your commitment to having a high-performance culture in your organisation must have the necessary level of inbuilt agility so that it doesn't just get parked when there is a pandemic. And you know, I don't want to be sounding like I'm mercenary about this, But the organisations that are going to, it's no surprise, the organisations that are going to come out of this robustly and well, and perhaps even in a better position, a stronger cultural position, are those organisations that are going to be just as committed, if not more so, around how they deliver feedback, how they get the best out of their people, how they work with the people to get the best out of themselves, and how they can deliver the most back to those people in terms of recognition and reward, notwithstanding all of the challenges. You need to think about what's happening with your appraisals. You need to think about how you're looking after your best performance. It's not as though recruitment's not happening. We can't make the mistake of assuming that no one's going anywhere just because there's a pandemic. Recruitment companies are still in existence. The job market still has some level of mobility, and we don't want to be the ones who lose good people because we have just assumed that no one is going anywhere. And the final point in terms of your legal checklist area is just recognising that the number of claims being brought. Indeed, the president of the Fair Work Commission, Ian Ross, last Friday put out a statement or a paper where he made it very clear that the Fair Work Commission has been inundated with claims, not just unfair dismissal claims, but also general protections claims, anti-bullying claims, claims arising from job seeker, and numerous others. So this is a highly litigious environment. The Fair Work Commission is not a cost-prohibitive jurisdiction. Unions continue to be doing their jobs and continue to be fairly active. The number of claims that are being made of bullying and harassment, be that sexual or otherwise, continues to rise. I'm be doing a webinar on the new landscape of sexual harassment next Wednesday, in fact, tomorrow week. And in that, I will be talking about how, pandemic or no pandemic, something like sexual harassment and something like bullying will always attract interest from employees who feel that they have been treated in a particular way, because they know that it is a term, it is a path that if you go down is going to attract attention. And that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but that is one of the reasons why there has been such a significant increase in the number of claims. Make no mistake, there are individuals in your organisation who will be aware that if they make a bullying claim, even if their role is made redundant down the track, they have opened up an additional legal avenue of redress for themselves that they would not have had if they did not make a bullying claim prior to being made redundant. This is the world. We can shake our heads and we can say, isn't it crazy, as if anyone would do that, but that is the world that we live in. So just to recap on those 5 areas, it's auditing your contracts, making sure you're on top of all of that. It's understanding your termination redundancy parameters, looking at your working from wherever, safety protocols, and general assessment, due diligence around how all of that's working, adhering to your performance culture, building that performance culture, and understanding that, finally, bullying and harassment claims are on the increase, as are so many. And while that might seem like there's a lot in there, well, in this environment, there continues to be more and more. And I would encourage you all to focus on each of those particular points, discuss them with your senior stakeholders, and consider what actions, if any, you need to take. And if there's any assistance that my team or I can provide, be delighted to. We are present in the virtual booth. That's going to be manned for the rest of today and tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you and hearing your questions in the live Q&A after this particular session. But for now, I'll hand back to John.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jordan. That was, again, what a tour de force, classically a typical combination of thoughtful and forthright views on where we're at in the world. You know, the thing that got me thinking, you're talking about planning, the importance of planning, and it got me thinking of that famous Dwight Eisenhower quote, which is plans are nothing, planning is everything. And I'm assuming you'd agree it's much more about having the planning process in place than necessarily the outcome at any point in time of the plans, given the amount of change going on in the world.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that the beauty of planning, and I know that, you know, exec teams often come in for derision in that there's a lot of talking and there are a lot of meetings at a talk fest and things like that, whatever. But there is a value in that discussion and the debate. And it's not necessarily about that destination. It is that journey. And what I sense is going to be a tragedy for a lot of organisations is that, insulated by JobKeeper, this period will just pass. And then all of a sudden, those big decisions having to be made, and there's just going to be a lot of angst. Why didn't we think this through? Why didn't we manage this? Surely we could have been on top of that. And now's the time. So, hence the guidance.
Okay. Well, now is also the time that we've run out of time, because we're hard up against the end. So I'm going to encourage anyone that has another question to go to the live Q&A. And Geordie, I think you'll be there for a while to take questions in the live Q&A. So rather than eating at the time of the next session, why don't we do that? Anyone who wants to talk to you can jump right now. So thank you again. Awesome run through of the current situation. Lots of challenges there, and I think lots of opportunities for all of us as well. So with that, we thank you to Geordie. We're virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much.
We're going to move on to the final section of the day, which is the last panel. Thanks, Geordie.
Thanks, John.